Chapter 27 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 27. It was Audrey's fate to be condemned by those whom she had most cared for. Ted and Vincent, Langley and Katherine, and lastly Mr. Flaxman Reed, they had all judged her, harshly, imperfectly as human nature judges. Of the five, perhaps Vincent, because he was a child of nature, and Katherine, because she was a good woman, alone appreciated the more pathetic of Audrey's effects. She presented the moving spectacle of a small creature struggling with things too great for her. Love, art, nature, religion, she had never really given herself up to any one of them. But she had called upon them all in turn, and instead of sustaining, they had overwhelmed her. And it seemed that Mr. Flaxman Reed, as the minister of the religion in which she had sought shelter for a day, had failed her the most unexpectedly and in her direst necessity. And yet he had done more for her than any of the others. She had lied to all of them; he had made it possible for her to be true. Flaxman Reed would certainly not have called himself a psychological realist, but by reason of his one strength, his habit of constant communion with the unseen, he had solved Langley Wyndham's problem. It would never have occurred to the great novelist, in his search for the real Audrey, to look deeper than the primitive passions, or to suspect that the secret of personality could lie in so pure a piece of mechanism as the human conscience. Soon after her confession Audrey left town for the neighbourhood of Oxford. She may have perceived that London was too vast a stage for her slender performances, or she may have had some idea of following up a line slanting gently between the two paths pointed out to her by Langley Wyndham and Flaxman Reed, who had been the strongest forces in her life. She had come to herself, but she was not the stuff of which renunciants are made. It was about 3 years later that Mr. Langley Wyndham, looking over his Times one morning, had the joy of reading the announcement of Miss Audrey Craven's marriage with Algernon Jackson, Esquire, of Broughton Poggs in the county of Oxfordshire. It was true. After all, Audrey had married a nonentity. It was the end of her long quest of the eminent and superlative. Mr. Jackson was certainly not an eminent person, and he was superlative only in so far as he passed for the biggest bore in the county. But he had the positive merit of being a gentleman, which in these days of a talented democracy amounts almost to genius. Since that night when, as a guileless undergraduate, he had interfered with Audrey's first introduction to Langley Wyndham, Mr. Jackson's career had been simplicity itself. He had tried most of the learned professions and failed in all he tried. He then took up model goose farming on a large scale, and achieved success amidst the jeers of his family and friends. The echo of that derision was soon lost in the jingle of Algernon's guineas. Not every one can attain a golden mediocrity, and it was a great step for a man who had hitherto ranked as a nonentity. On the strength of it he asked the beautiful Miss Craven to be his wife, and no one was more surprised than himself when she consented. She was his first and last love of a series of loves. For Mr. Jackson had never read Laura, indeed he read but few books, and if you had told him of Langley Wyndham's masterpiece today, he would have forgotten all about it by tomorrow. He would certainly never have thought of identifying its heroine with his wife. Nobody ever understood why Audrey made that marriage. For any one who had enjoyed the friendship of such men as Langley Wyndham and Flaxman Reed, there was bathos in the step. It seemed an ugly concession to actuality. It may have been. For Audrey was nothing if not modern, the daughter of an age that has flirted with half a dozen ideals, all equally fascinating, and finally decided in favour of a mature realism. She may have learned that hardest lesson of the schools, the translation of life's drama from fancy into fact; found out that all the time the grey old chorus has been singing not of love and joy, as she once in her ignorance imagined, but of unspeakable rest on the great consoling platitudes of life, where there is no more revelation because there is no mystery, and no despair because there is no hope. The text of that chorus is often corrupt, but the meaning is never hopelessly obscure. In other words, she may have married Mr. Jackson in a fit of pessimism. Or perhaps she had profited by the more cheerful though equally important lesson of the playground; learned that whether the game of life be fast or slow, dull or amusing, matters little when you are knocked out in the first round. She herself had had many rounds, not counting Mr. Jackson. that in these circumstances one may still find considerable entertainment in looking on, and that in any case the player is not for the game, but the game for the player. The player, who may be left on the ground long after all games have been played out. But this is to suppose that Audrey was a philosopher, which is manifestly absurd. Perhaps, more likely than not, her revelation came when she was least looking for it, stumbling by the merest accident on one of the great things of life, the eternal, the incomprehensible, for of these some say that the greatest is love. It is certainly the most incomprehensible. She may have loved Mr. Jackson. If she did not, she has never let him know it. End of chapter 27. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair.